It was a crisp morning in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the streets buzzed with the usual hum of weekday activity. Yet amidst the cars and pedestrians, something stood out, something so profound that traffic slowed and people stopped in their tracks. Pastor Stephen Furtick, founder of Elevation Church and one of the most influential spiritual leaders in the country, walked steadily down the street, carrying a large wooden cross on his shoulder. It wasn't for a sermon, nor a photo shoot. This was something deeply personal, something defiant, something spiritual. He had started his walk from the front doors of Elevation Church, under the soft rays of the morning sun. As he walked past neighborhoods and city blocks, murmurs began. Phones came out. People recorded. Some cheered, some jeered, but Stephen remained silent, focused. Every step was deliberate. Then, the blue and red lights flashed behind him. A police cruiser slowly pulled up alongside. Two officers stepped out, cautious but respectful. "Pastor Furtick?" one of them asked. He turned to them, sweat on his brow, but his eyes steady. "Yes, officer? We're going to have to ask you to stop. There's been a complaint, something about obstruction of traffic and public safety. I'm sorry, but we've been instructed to bring you in." Stephen took a deep breath, set the cross gently on the sidewalk, and looked the officer in the eye. "Is this still America?" he asked calmly. The officer hesitated. "Sir, we don't want to arrest you, but we've got orders. The city says you're violating Municipal Code 14-118, unlawful obstruction of pedestrian pathways." Stephen nodded. "Then take me in." Whispers turned into shouts. People began to gather. Someone screamed, "You can't arrest a man for carrying a cross!" But within moments, Stephen was in the back of the cruiser, the cross left behind on the grass. The news spread like wildfire. "Pastor arrested for religious expression." Stephen Furtick detained. First Amendment under fire? Within hours, every major news outlet had a headline. Twitter exploded. His followers and critics alike jumped into the fray. But the real shock came the next day, in court. The hearing was supposed to be routine, a fine, maybe community service. But when the judge entered, something about the air shifted. Judge Ronald Ellison, a man with a stern reputation and little patience for public stunts, eyed Stephen with an unreadable expression. "This is not a circus," the judge began. "You're a public figure, Mr. Furtick. That means your actions carry weight. Carrying a giant cross down a busy city street is not just a spectacle, it's a hazard. You violated the law." Stephen stood, hands clasped in front of him. "Your Honor, I understand the law, but I also understand my rights. I wasn't protesting. I wasn't blocking traffic. I was walking quietly, carrying a symbol of my faith, the same faith this nation was founded on." The judge narrowed his eyes. "You're fined $1,500. Case closed." But that was when everything changed. Stephen didn't sit down. He didn't nod. Instead, he stepped forward, pulling a thick leather-bound book from his bag. It wasn't a Bible. It was the Constitution. "Your Honor," Stephen said, his voice steady, "I respectfully challenge this fine, and I intend to represent myself." A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the judge raised an eyebrow. "You're going to what?" he asked. "I studied constitutional law before I ever became a pastor," Stephen said. "I know what I'm doing." The judge smirked. "This ought to be interesting." Over the next week, Pastor Furtick transformed from preacher to legal warrior. He spent every waking hour preparing. Legal pads filled with notes, law books spread across his office table, video calls with old law professors, and deep dives into landmark cases. His team at Elevation was stunned. "Pastor, are you sure this is the way?" one of his elders asked. Stephen looked up from his stack of papers. "I'm not just doing this for me. I'm doing it for anyone who's ever been told to sit down when they should be standing up for what they believe." The next hearing came quickly. The courtroom was packed. Cameras rolled. Supporters wore shirts with crosses. Opponents held signs about safety and the separation of church and state. But Stephen walked in alone, carrying only the Constitution and a binder. He approached the bench. Judge Ellison looked at him, clearly intrigued. "You ready, Pastor?" Stephen nodded. "More than ready." And then he began. "For more than 200 years, this country has protected the right of every citizen to express their religious beliefs," he said. "The First Amendment is not a suggestion. It is a guarantee. I didn't block traffic. I didn't incite violence. I carried a cross, a personal act of faith, and I did so on public sidewalks, which courts have repeatedly affirmed as traditional public forums." He cited case after case, from Burwell v. Hobby Lobby to Reed v. Town of Gilbert. He argued not only the law, but the principle behind it. His words were passionate, but precise. His tone was respectful but unyielding. People in the courtroom leaned forward. Even the judge couldn't hide his interest. By the end of the hearing, Stephen closed his binder, looked the judge in the eye, and said, "Your Honor, if we start punishing silent expressions of faith, we're not protecting freedom. We're dismantling it." The courtroom was silent. Judge Ellison tapped his pen against the bench, deep in thought. Then he leaned back and said something no one expected. "Mr. Furtick, I underestimated you." Judge Ellison paused for a long moment before he spoke again. "You've clearly done your homework, Pastor. And while I still believe there are public safety concerns to consider, I also recognize the constitutional implications you've raised. I'll need time to deliberate." With that, he banged the gavel and adjourned the court, leaving a wave of murmurs behind him. The cameras caught Stephen stepping down from the bench area, his face calm, but eyes burning with purpose. Reporters swarmed him as he exited the courthouse, microphones pushed in his direction, all shouting questions at once. "Pastor Furtick, are you turning this into a political crusade? Is this a publicity stunt for your church? Do you think you'll actually win this case?" Stephen stopped, looked out over the sea of flashing lights and voices, and simply said, "This isn't about me. This is about faith, freedom, and standing firm when it matters most." The story exploded even more. The hashtag #WashCrossonTrial began trending. Late-night hosts debated whether he was a hero or a grandstander. Political commentators took sides. Legal analysts dissected his arguments and speculated on how the judge might rule. Meanwhile, Stephen went back to preaching on Sundays like nothing had changed, except that everything had. Attendance at Elevation Church tripled in 2 weeks. The congregation swelled with people who'd never stepped foot in a church before, drawn by the courage and controversy of the man at its helm. Stephen didn't change his message. He didn't start preaching about the trial. He kept teaching the Word, staying true to what got him there in the first place. But behind the scenes, he was still preparing. The judge's decision could come at any moment, and Stephen wasn't naive. He knew this wasn't just a local court case anymore. This was becoming something bigger, a test case for religious liberty, and a possible precedent for churches across the country. Then one morning, he received a certified letter at the church office. The final ruling. He opened it slowly, hands trembling just slightly. The words stared back at him. "In consideration of the arguments presented and upon review of constitutional precedent, the court finds in favor of the defendant, Pastor Stephen Furtick. The fine is dismissed. No further action will be taken." For a second, Stephen just stood there, silent. Then a smile crept across his face. Not because he had won, but because the principle had been defended. He walked out into the sanctuary where a few staff members were gathering for a team meeting. "It's over," he said. "What do you mean?" asked one of his assistant pastors. "We won." The judge dropped the fine. A cheer erupted in the room. Tears flowed. Hugs were exchanged. But Stephen raised a hand. "This isn't the end," he said. "This is just the beginning. We proved something important, that truth still matters and courage still counts. But there are others who don't have the platform I do, others who are being silenced in ways no one sees. We need to speak up for them too." That night, Stephen stood before a packed house and addressed the church with a fire in his spirit that hadn't been seen in a long time. "We are not ashamed of the gospel. We are not ashamed of the cross. And if we have to carry it through every street, face every court, and challenge every opposition to do what God called us to do, we will." The crowd erupted into applause, some standing with tears streaming down their cheeks. That moment was more than a victory speech. It was a declaration of purpose. The next day, Elevation Church announced the formation of a new initiative, the Freedom to Faith Legal Fund. Its mission was to provide legal assistance to individuals and ministries facing persecution or restrictions on religious expression. Donations poured in from all over the country. Lawyers volunteered pro bono. It was the start of a movement. But not everyone was pleased. The city council, embarrassed by the outcome and under pressure from vocal critics, began looking for ways to push back. They initiated a review of permits for religious events, proposed new regulations for public religious displays, and quietly tried to block Elevation Church's expansion plans for a new campus. Stephen didn't flinch. He attended the next city council meeting in person. this time wearing a suit and holding a legal file instead of a cross. He calmly presented his case, cited municipal codes, constitutional protections, and past court rulings. By the time he finished, the entire room sat in stunned silence. Even some council members who had been pushing the new restrictions shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A local paper ran a headline the next day: "Pastor or Lawyer? Stephen Furtick School's City Council on Religious Rights." Back at church, Stephen reflected on everything that had happened. It wasn't the path he'd imagined. He never intended to become a public figure in the legal arena. But sometimes the cross leads you down unexpected roads, and sometimes it takes you straight through the fire. One evening, sitting in his study, he opened his Bible and turned to Acts 5:29. We must obey God rather than men. He underlined the verse slowly, then looked out the window toward the church courtyard. A new cross stood there now. Simple, wooden, tall, not carried through the streets, but standing for everyone to see. A reminder, a symbol, not just of Christ's sacrifice, but of the courage to carry it, no matter the cost. The door to his study opened. "Pastor, there's someone here to see you. Says he's from the governor's office." Stephen raised an eyebrow. "Send him in," he said. And just like that, the next chapter began. The man who stepped into Stephen Furtick's study wore a crisp gray suit and carried himself with the kind of poise that suggested politics wasn't just a job. It was in his blood. He extended a hand and smiled politely, though there was something measured in his eyes. "Pastor Furtick, my name is Andrew Levin. I'm a legal advisor from the governor's office. May I?" Stephen gestured toward the seat across from his desk. "Of course. What brings the governor's office to my church?" Andrew sat, pulled out a sleek leather portfolio and flipped it open. "To be frank, your recent case has garnered significant attention, not just in legal circles, but at the highest levels of state governance." The governor was impressed, very impressed. Stephen leaned back, watching him closely. "Impressed enough to send someone down here?" "Let's just say he's curious and concerned. The judge's ruling has created something of a domino effect. We're seeing copycat actions across the state. People walking with crosses, handing out scripture in front of courthouses, even setting up open-air worship sessions in municipal parks without permits." Stephen raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like people expressing their faith." Andrew nodded. "Yes, and it's your case that emboldened them, which brings me to why I'm here. The governor would like to meet with you privately to discuss what's happening, maybe find a way to, shall we say, strike a balance." Stephen didn't answer right away. He rose from his chair, walked to the window, and looked out at the courtyard. The cross still stood tall. A few children played nearby while their parents talked quietly on benches. He turned back to Andrew. "With all due respect," Stephen said, "what kind of balance are we talking about? Because if it means compromising the truth of the gospel, I'm not interested." Andrew's smile didn't fade, but his tone grew more serious. "No one's asking you to compromise your faith. But political tension is rising. Civil liberties groups are clashing with city officials. Lawsuits are being filed. The governor wants to get ahead of this." Stephen considered that. He didn't distrust the man, but he didn't trust him either. "When and where?" he asked. "Tomorrow. Governor's mansion. Noon." Stephen nodded. "I'll be there." The next day, Stephen arrived in a modest SUV, dressed in his usual black jeans and blazer. No entourage, no fanfare. He was escorted into the governor's private meeting room, where Governor Wallace Kane, a strong-featured man with a commanding presence, stood waiting with his hands behind his back. "Pastor Furtick," Kane said, extending his hand, "you've stirred up quite a firestorm." "I didn't stir anything, Governor. I just carried a cross." Kane chuckled. "And you carried it straight into court and won. Impressive legal arguments. I read your filing myself." Stephen remained standing. "So why am I here?" Kane motioned for him to sit. "Because we're at a tipping point. Religious expression is important, but so is public order. If we're not careful, this could spiral. Protests, counter-protests. I've got city mayors calling me in a panic. And while I respect your position, I have to think about everyone." Stephen leaned forward slightly. "And I have to think about the gospel. That's my calling, not popularity, not politics." Kane studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You remind me of my father. He was a preacher too, stubborn as a mule and twice as loud." Stephen smiled faintly. "Then you know why I can't back down. I don't want you to back down, but I need your help. I want you to join a state advisory board on faith and civil liberties. Help us shape policy. Help us avoid unnecessary confrontation." Stephen tilted his head. "You want me to be a liaison? I want you to be a bridge," Kane said. It was tempting. Influence, opportunity, a seat at the table. But Stephen knew that every offer had a price. "I'll think about it," he said carefully. As he left the mansion, cameras caught him stepping out onto the steps. Reporters fired questions, but Stephen simply said, "I met with the governor. We had an honest conversation. That's all I'll say for now." Later that night, Stephen sat in prayer, seeking clarity. He knew that influence could open doors, but it could also dilute purpose. Could he remain true to his mission while engaging in political spheres? Or would it slowly erode the fire that drove him? His wife, Holly, found him still in his office, lost in thought. "What's on your heart?" she asked gently. He looked at her. "They want me to help shape policy, advise on matters of faith and freedom. And I'm torn. I don't want to become part of the system, but maybe God's calling me to be light within the system." She smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then be light, but don't let them dim you." The next Sunday, Stephen stood on stage and told his congregation everything. The trial, the invitation, the offer. "I won't make a decision behind closed doors," he said. "This church is not just a building, it's a body. If I accept this role, I want you to hold me accountable, because no matter how big the table is, I only want to sit at it if Jesus has a seat too." The room erupted in applause, and so he accepted the position, not as a politician, but as a pastor. A few weeks later, he stood at the first state advisory meeting. He was the only one not in a suit, the only one with a Bible open on the desk in front of him. When the discussion began, it was about policy, strategy, optics. But when Stephen spoke, he said only this: "People are scared to express their faith. That should scare all of us." And with that, the real work began. The first few sessions of the advisory board were tense. Most of the members were seasoned bureaucrats, lawyers, professors, and lobbyists who lived in a world of jargon and compromise. Stephen stood out, not just in appearance, but in conviction. He didn't speak often, but when he did, the room fell quiet. There was no political spin in his words, no agenda hiding behind a smile. He simply told the truth, grounded in scripture and in common sense. At first, they underestimated him. Some rolled their eyes, others dismissed him as a charismatic preacher with no real understanding of policy. But it didn't take long for that perception to change. During one heated session on a proposed regulation that would limit public religious displays, Stephen calmly opened his folder and presented a list of community leaders, pastors, rabbis, and imams who opposed the move. "These aren't radicals," he said. "They're fathers, mothers, neighbors. They represent thousands of people who just want to live their faith without being treated like a threat." The room shifted. People leaned forward. One board member, a constitutional law professor from Raleigh, cleared her throat and asked, "Pastor, did you compile this yourself?" "I did," Stephen replied. "I spoke with every one of them personally." And just like that, the vote shifted. The proposal was dropped. The professor later pulled Stephen aside and said, "You're not just a preacher. You're a force." Stephen simply smiled. "I'm just a servant." But not everyone was pleased with his growing influence. Behind closed doors, whispers started. A few lobbyists and politicians were uncomfortable with a pastor wielding so much sway over policy. They started digging. Old sermons were pulled, edited out of context, and leaked to media outlets. Headlines appeared. "Pastor turned politician. Is Furtick blurring the line between church and state? Elevation church leader under fire for extremist views on culture and morality." Stephen wasn't surprised. He'd seen this before. The enemy didn't always attack from the outside. It crept in through doubt, distraction, and division. One night, he gathered his leadership team and showed them the articles. The room was tense. "What should we do?" one of the younger staffers asked. "Issue a statement? Call a press conference?" Stephen shook his head. "No, we don't defend ourselves with press releases. We let our fruit speak for us." He took a deep breath. "But I will address this." That Sunday, he stood on stage with no notes, just his Bible. The room was packed, and thousands more watched online. "Some of you have seen the headlines," he began. "They say I'm trying to bring church into politics, that I'm forcing my beliefs onto others. Let me tell you something. If standing up for the rights of every believer makes me a threat, then I'll wear that badge with honor. I'm not here to play politics. I'm here to make sure our children and grandchildren grow up in a country where they're not afraid to pray, to speak the name of Jesus, or to carry a cross down a public street." The crowd erupted. Truth will always be uncomfortable in a world that feeds on compromise. But we weren't called to be comfortable. We were called to be bold. That clip went viral. Millions watched it within hours. Even networks that previously criticized him aired parts of the sermon. The governor called later that day. "You lit a fire, Pastor. You sure you're ready for what comes next?" Stephen smiled. "I didn't start the fire. I'm just not afraid to walk through it." Meanwhile, the advisory board was gaining national attention. Religious leaders from across the country began reaching out, seeking guidance on how to handle similar challenges in their cities and states. Stephen's email was flooded. Churches started quoting him in sermons. Some even called him America's pastor, though he rejected the title. One evening, while walking the halls of the church, he found himself in the youth room. A group of teenagers was practicing a worship set, and one of them, a young girl with bright eyes and a bold voice, sang a chorus he'd never heard before. It was about courage, about carrying the cross, about speaking truth no matter the cost. He asked where it came from. "We wrote it," she said. "You inspired it." Tears welled up in his eyes. Not because of pride, but because he realized that this was the real legacy. Not the courtroom win, not the board seat, but the spark of faith he'd helped ignite in the next generation. Still, the pressure didn't stop. One morning, his assistant handed him an envelope marked "Confidential." Inside was a legal notice, a new lawsuit. A coalition of secular organizations was suing him, claiming that his influence on the advisory board violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. They were demanding his removal and an injunction against the board itself. Stephen read the letter twice, then looked up and said, "They're trying to silence faith again." His legal team offered to fight the case. High-powered lawyers called, offering their services. But Stephen made a decision. "I'll defend this the same way I defended the cross." Personally, his team protested. "Pastor, this is different. This is federal. It could go to the Supreme Court." "Then let it," Stephen said. "We go where the cross leads." And so the stage was set for another battle. Bigger, louder, with national implications. But Stephen wasn't afraid. He had walked this road before. He had carried the cross through the streets. He had stood before judges and councils. And now he would stand again, not as a politician, not as a celebrity, but as a man of faith, armed with truth, and ready for whatever came next. The days leading up to the federal hearing were filled with a strange mix of spiritual peace and legal preparation. Stephen spent his mornings in prayer and his afternoons buried in law books. He knew the stakes were higher this time. This wasn't just about a personal fine or a walk with a cross. This was about his right to stand in the public square and represent his faith without being silenced by legal technicalities and cultural hostility. The lawsuit accused him of using his religious position to influence government policy, claiming a violation of the Establishment Clause. The plaintiffs included a coalition of secular advocacy groups, several well-known atheists, and even a few disgruntled former politicians. They painted Stephen as a manipulator, someone who blurred the line between pulpit and policy to push a theocratic agenda. Stephen had read the full complaint more than once. He wasn't angry. He was resolved. He stood once again in a courtroom, this time in Washington, D.C., surrounded by a flurry of national attention. Protesters and supporters filled the sidewalks outside. Some carried signs that read, "Church and State, separate for a reason," while others raised banners saying, "Let the pastor speak." Inside, the federal courtroom was buzzing. This time, the opposing side had a formidable team of attorneys, well-paid, well-connected, and ready to make an example of Stephen. But he stood alone at the defense table, wearing the same calm expression he had worn the day he carried the cross. The judge, a respected woman known for her sharp mind and no-nonsense demeanor, called the hearing to order. Her eyes briefly scanned the courtroom and landed on Stephen. "Mr. Furtick, are you still choosing to represent yourself?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Stephen replied, respectfully and prayerfully. The lead attorney for the plaintiff stood and launched into a passionate argument. He claimed that Pastor Furtick had violated the Establishment Clause by blurring the line between church and state, that his influence on state policy was tantamount to religious favoritism, that his presence on the advisory board created an atmosphere of coercion for those who didn't share his beliefs. Stephen listened quietly, taking notes. He waited patiently until the judge called on him. When he finally stood, he walked slowly to the center of the courtroom, not to grandstand, not to perform, but to speak the truth. "Your Honor," he began, "I did not join the advisory board as a representative of any single denomination. I joined as an American citizen concerned with preserving the very freedoms this Constitution promises to all people, religious or not." He held up the Constitution, worn and marked from weeks of use. Nowhere in this document does it say that faith disqualifies someone from serving the public. The Establishment Clause is not about silencing faith. It's about preventing the government from establishing a national religion or favoring one religion over another. I have never asked for special treatment. I have never used my role to force my beliefs on anyone. I have simply spoken as a citizen, as a pastor, and as a man of conscience. The opposing counsel objected. "Your Honor, he's turning this into a sermon." But the judge raised her hand. "He has the floor," Stephen continued. "If my role on that board is unconstitutional, then so is every faith-based opinion ever voiced in a public forum. Are we to tell rabbis, imams, priests, or anyone guided by faith that their voice no longer counts? That their conscience must be checked at the door of government? That is not freedom. That is censorship." He paused and looked around the room. "This isn't just my fight. This is about the fabric of who we are as a nation." There was a long silence in the courtroom. Even the plaintiff attorneys looked uneasy. The judge said nothing for a full minute. Then she simply said, "Court will recess until tomorrow. I need time to consider this." Outside, the press erupted. Once again, the footage of Pastor Furtick's argument went viral. This time, it wasn't just religious communities sharing the video, it was civil liberties groups, law professors, and political commentators across the spectrum. Some praised him as a hero. Others warned that he was setting a dangerous precedent. But no one could deny the power and clarity of his words. That night, Stephen walked the streets of Washington alone. No cameras, no entourage, just him, a worn coat, and his thoughts. He stopped by a small church and stepped inside. The building was empty, lit only by candles. He knelt at the altar and whispered a quiet prayer. "God, if this is where you've led me, give me strength to keep walking, not for applause, not for victory, but for truth." The next morning, the courtroom was even more packed. Security had to turn people away. The judge entered and called the room to order. She didn't waste words. "I have reviewed the arguments, the precedents, and the facts. While this case raises important questions about the intersection of faith and public service, I find no evidence that Pastor Furtick violated the Establishment Clause. His actions were consistent with those of any citizen offering counsel in a governmental advisory capacity. This court upholds his right to serve on the advisory board. The case is dismissed." Gasps filled the courtroom. A few people stood and applauded, but Stephen remained still. No fist pump, no smile, just a deep breath and a bowed head. Outside, the press mobbed him again. "Pastor Furtick, how do you feel? What will you do now?" Stephen looked into the cameras and said, "This isn't about winning. This is about standing. Standing for truth, for freedom, and for every person who's ever felt like they had to hide their faith to be heard. You don't have to choose between your beliefs and your voice. You can speak from both." Back in Charlotte, the celebration was quiet. The church gathered for prayer and thanksgiving, not for the courtroom victory, but for the strength God had given them through the storm. Stephen preached that Sunday on Daniel in the lion's den. "We don't serve a God who promises comfort," he told the crowd. "We serve a God who promises presence. And when you stand for him, he stands with you, even in courtrooms, even in headlines, even in the lion's den." The movement continued to grow. The Freedom to Faith Legal Fund expanded nationally. Churches, schools, and religious leaders found new boldness. A cultural shift was beginning, not loud, not angry, but rooted in truth and unwavering in conviction. And Pastor Stephen Furtick, he kept preaching, kept walking, kept carrying the cross, now not just through the streets of Charlotte, but through the halls of power, the glare of scrutiny, and the hearts of millions who'd found courage through his stand. Weeks after the federal court victory, Stephen began noticing a shift, not only in how people viewed him, but in how they viewed themselves. His inbox overflowed with messages from believers who had found their voice again, teachers who began praying privately before class again, students requesting Bible study groups on campus, business owners who'd stopped hiding their faith in fear of offending customers. Something deep was stirring in the nation's soul, and Stephen could feel it. One message in particular caught his attention. It came from a man named Darnell Whitaker, a janitor at a high school in rural Georgia. The email was simple, heartfelt. Pastor Furtick, I just wanted to thank you. I've carried a small wooden cross in my pocket every day for 23 years. But after your story, I decided to wear it around my neck again. Some kids laughed at me. Some teachers asked me to take it off, but I didn't. I'm standing tall now. Thank you for reminding me I'm not alone. Stephen sat back in his chair, overwhelmed. The battle in court had been tough, but this was why it mattered. Not for headlines, not for influence, but for people like Darnell, men and women who lived quiet lives of faith, waiting for someone to remind them they had a right to shine. Despite the victory, opposition hadn't disappeared. It had evolved. A few political groups launched campaigns painting Stephen as a religious extremist. Billboards appeared along highways in major cities. Keep church in church. Faith is personal, not political. Beware the cross bearer. But Stephen didn't flinch. He didn't address the attacks publicly. He simply kept preaching, kept serving, and kept advocating. Then came an unexpected development. A major university reached out, one of the most prestigious law schools in the country. They asked if Stephen would consider guest lecturing for a course titled Faith and the Constitution. It was unprecedented, controversial, and risky for the institution. But the dean stood by the invitation. Your case is now required reading, she told Stephen over the phone. And your perspective is one our students need to hear, whether they agree with it or not. Stephen prayed over the decision. He didn't want to become an academic, but he understood the opportunity. The next generation of lawyers would shape the future of freedom. So, he accepted. The lecture hall was packed when he arrived. Professors, students, media, security. Cameras were set up in the back of the room, broadcasting the session live. Some students wore expressions of curiosity, others, skepticism. A few made no attempt to hide their disapproval. Stephen began with a story. I once carried a cross down the street and got arrested. I didn't shout. I didn't block traffic. I didn't protest. I just walked, quietly, faithfully. And that act, simple and symbolic, sparked a legal firestorm that spread far beyond my city. What followed wasn't about religion versus government. It was about rights. Yours, mine, all of ours. He walked the students through the legal arguments, the court decisions, the constitutional principles. He didn't preach. He taught, respectfully, thoughtfully, passionately. Near the end, a student raised his hand. Pastor, I respect your conviction, but don't you think there's a danger in too much religious presence in public life? What about people who don't believe? Don't they deserve to feel safe and heard too? Stephen smiled. Absolutely. That's the point of freedom. It's not just for the majority. It's for everyone. I don't want a government that forces Christianity any more than I want one that bans it. I want a society where people of all faiths, or no faith, can live in peace without fear of being silenced. The student nodded, visibly moved. After the lecture, dozens lined up to shake Stephen's hand. Some wanted selfies. Others whispered thanks. A few just stood silently, eyes wide, like they were seeing something they hadn't expected. That night, Stephen returned to his hotel room and knelt by the bed. He thanked God not for applause, but for the opportunity to open hearts, even for one day. Back in Charlotte, Elevation Church had become more than a ministry. It had become a movement, a hub for people who believed that faith should be fearless and that freedom wasn't something handed down. It was something to be protected. Young lawyers began attending. City leaders asked for prayer. Local police officers stopped by for weekly devotionals. What had started with a cross on a sidewalk was now transforming an entire community. But then came the call that shifted everything again. A small town in Ohio was facing a lawsuit. A local pastor had been fined for preaching outdoors without a permit. It was a familiar pattern: pressure from advocacy groups, overreach from local government, and fear seeping into the church. Stephen's team looked into it. They're calling it the New Cross case, one of his assistants said. The whole town is watching. The church is scared. They don't have the resources to fight back. Stephen didn't hesitate. Tell them I'm coming." When he arrived, the church was holding a prayer vigil in a parking lot. People stood in circles, holding candles, singing hymns, crying, hoping. Stephen stepped onto the makeshift stage, microphone in hand, and said only one thing: "You're not alone." The crowd erupted in cheers and tears. It wasn't just about legal help. It was about presence, about standing together. Within 48 hours, legal paperwork was filed. A defense was launched. And Stephen stood once again, not as a celebrity, but as a servant. That night, back in his hotel, he looked out at the moonlit sky and whispered, "Lord, if carrying the cross means carrying the burden of others, I'll carry it wherever you send me." And in that quiet, sacred moment, Stephen Furtick understood the weight of his calling. Not just to preach, not just to lead, but to stand, speak, and carry truth, through streets, through courtrooms, through conflict, and through culture. One step at a time. The morning after the vigil in Ohio, Stephen woke up to a flood of notifications. The story had once again gone viral. National news outlets were broadcasting clips from his appearance, focusing on the now iconic line, "You're not alone." Social media lit up with posts from pastors, faith leaders, and ordinary people who had felt isolated, discouraged, or afraid to speak up. Now they had something, or someone, to rally around. But it wasn't just encouragement. There was resistance too. An op-ed in a major paper ran with the headline, "Furtick's Crusade, a threat to secular order." A popular late-night host mocked the situation with a skit featuring a fake cross being wheeled into court. And local officials in Ohio weren't thrilled to have a national figure stepping into their jurisdiction. Stephen's team cautioned him. "This could escalate quickly. They're watching your every move." Stephen nodded. "Let them watch. What they see won't be arrogance. It'll be obedience." That afternoon, he met with Pastor Leon, the Ohio preacher facing the lawsuit. Leon was a gentle, gray-haired man with kind eyes and a soft voice that belied a deep fire within him. His small church had been holding outdoor worship services ever since their building had suffered structural damage from a storm. They applied for permits, but the process was slow. When they continued to meet outdoors, they were fined $2,000 and warned of additional penalties. "I never meant to cause trouble," Leon said, hands trembling slightly as he poured coffee. "I just couldn't let my flock scatter. They needed a place to gather, to pray, to worship." Stephen placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Pastor, and you're not going to walk this road alone." Together they worked with legal counsel and filed an appeal. Stephen offered to speak at the next city council meeting, not as a provocateur, but as a peacemaker. That night, the town hall was packed. More than 300 people crowded into a room designed for 80. Outside, hundreds more stood with candles and handmade signs that read, "Let us worship." Stephen stood before the council and began, "I didn't come here to argue. I didn't come here to fight. I came here to remind us all what freedom looks like. It looks like a small-town pastor trying to keep his community together after disaster strikes. It looks like worshipers gathering under the open sky when their sanctuary is broken. It looks like compassion, not litigation." He paused, letting the silence stretch before continuing. "If we fine pastors for holding services in parking lots, what's next? Fining people for praying in parks? Arresting choirs for singing in public squares? We must be careful not to legislate away the very liberties that make this nation strong." Some council members looked down at their hands. Others stared at him intently. "I'm not asking for chaos," Stephen said. "I'm asking for grace, for understanding, for partnership. Let's fix this, not with fines, but with dialogue." A wave of applause broke out. The council chair banged his gavel, but the message had landed. By the end of the week, the fine was dropped. The city agreed to fast-track the church's permit application and offered temporary use of a local park for weekly services. It wasn't just a legal win. It was a community restored. Stephen returned to Charlotte with a full heart but a weary body. Holly met him at the airport and wrapped him in a long hug. "You're running on fumes," she said gently. He nodded. "But it's a good tired." Still, the exhaustion lingered. Not just physically, but emotionally. Every city, every courtroom, every confrontation took a piece of him. And yet, he couldn't stop. The need was too great. The call too clear. One evening, he sat with his son Elijah on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the trees. "Dad," Elijah said, "why do people hate what you're doing? You're just helping churches." Stephen smiled. Sometimes, buddy, when you stand for something, people who are afraid of that truth will push back. It doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you're shining. Elijah thought about that, then nodded. Can I help too? Stephen's heart swelled. You already are. Meanwhile, news broke that a national organization was preparing to file a class action suit, challenging faith-based advisory boards across multiple states. Their argument? That having religious leaders in policy discussions created an imbalance of ideology in public governance. Stephen's role on the advisory board once again came under scrutiny. This time the pressure was federal. Senators were calling hearings, political analysts debated his every word, and somewhere deep in the chaos, Stephen realized something. This wasn't about one man anymore. It was about the future of the church and public life. He called a gathering at Elevation Church, not for cameras, not for public relations, but for leaders. Pastors from across the nation flew in. Youth leaders, evangelists, chaplains, Christian attorneys, worship leaders. Over 200 of them filled the sanctuary for a closed-door meeting titled simply, The Cross and the Constitution. Stephen stood on stage and spoke with fire in his bones. We're not here to fight culture. We're here to shape it. Not through anger, but through presence, through prayer, through perseverance. We will not be bullied out of the public square. We will not be silent, and we will not trade the cross for comfort. The room erupted with "Amen" and shouts of agreement. We don't need to be loud, he said. We need to be clear. We don't need to win arguments. We need to win souls. But to do that, we must show the world that faith is not a threat. It's the foundation. By the end of the night, something had shifted. A coalition had been formed, a national network of leaders ready to carry the cross, not just in worship, but in law, in government, in education, in the arts, not to dominate, but to serve. Stephen stood at the altar long after the room had emptied, hands clasped, eyes closed. Lord, if this is the path, I will walk it. If this is the fire, I will face it. If this is the burden, I will bear it. For you. He didn't hear an audible voice. He didn't need to. The peace in his spirit was answer enough. A few days later, Stephen was invited to speak at a national leadership conference in Washington, D.C., hosted by a bipartisan committee aiming to address religious liberty issues with civility and collaboration. It was a rare setting. Senators, governors, university chancellors, legal scholars, and community leaders all under one roof. Some attended with curiosity, others with concern, and many still unsure of what to make of the man who had gone from megachurch pastor to the unexpected face of a constitutional revival. As Stephen stepped up to the podium, a hush settled over the room. No flashy entrance, no production, just a man with conviction in his voice and scripture in his heart. He began simply, "When I carried that cross through Charlotte, I didn't do it for attention. I did it because the weight of that symbol still matters." And what happened next? Well, I believe it revealed something deeper, a spiritual hunger, a legal confusion, and an opportunity for healing. He glanced around the room, pausing to let the moment land. Some people believe that faith should stay behind closed doors, that God belongs in churches and not in courthouses. But I'm here to tell you, faith is not a hobby, it's not a club, and it's not a Sunday morning appointment. It's a way of life, and that means it walks with us into every room, every classroom, every courtroom, every boardroom. There were nods from unexpected places. Even some officials who had once questioned his involvement on state boards were leaning in, captivated. Stephen continued, "This isn't about turning America into a theocracy. I don't want a church-run government, but I also don't want a government that's allergic to the mention of God. There has to be space for faith to breathe, for values to guide, for conscience to speak without fear." Applause broke out, respectful but strong. He closed with a story about a young girl who had sent him a drawing of a cross being held up by tiny stick figures. At the bottom she wrote, "Even little hands can carry big things if God helps them." Stephen looked into the camera broadcasting live across the country. "I'm just one of those little hands, and I believe you are too." The moment resonated nationwide. Clips of his speech were shared across platforms. Some called it the most unifying religious address in a generation. Others still resisted. But a tone had been set, one of bridge building instead of division, clarity without condemnation. Back at Elevation Church, Stephen returned to his rhythm, preaching, teaching, mentoring, and walking with his community through everyday life. But something in the air had changed. Sunday services were now attended by a broader cross-section of America. People from diverse political and cultural backgrounds came, not just to hear a sermon, but to experience something real. Then came an unexpected development. A proposal was introduced in Congress, the Religious Expression in Civic Life Act, a bipartisan bill designed to protect citizens from discrimination based on religious activity in public spaces. It wasn't perfect, and Stephen knew legislation could never substitute for transformation, but still, it was a step, a conversation starter, a possible shift in policy that could affirm what he and so many others had fought to protect. Stephen was asked to testify before Congress. This time, the stakes were national. He sat before the committee, a panel of senators asking questions that ranged from curious to combative. One senator, known for his staunch opposition to public faith expressions, leaned in and asked, "Pastor Furtick, do you truly believe America benefits from more public displays of religion? Doesn't that risk alienating non-believers?" Stephen answered without flinching, "Senator, I believe America benefits when people live with integrity, when what we believe in private aligns with how we live in public. I'm not asking everyone to follow Jesus, but I'm asking that no one be punished for doing so." Another senator asked if he thought the bill was enough. "It's a start," Stephen said, "but real change won't come from laws. It'll come from courage, from men and women of faith living unashamedly, loving radically, and leading faithfully." The room was quiet. Even his critics found little to contest. When the hearing adjourned, a veteran senator approached Stephen privately. "I've sat in this chamber for 30 years, he said. "I've heard thousands of testimonies, but what you just gave wasn't testimony, it was revival." Stephen smiled humbly. Revival doesn't start in a room. It starts in a heart. A few weeks later, the bill passed committee review. It wouldn't be law yet, but it was moving, and Stephen's influence was now undeniable. But with greater exposure came greater danger. One morning, a threatening letter arrived at the church, then another, and another. Messages from anonymous senders warning Stephen to stop preaching in politics and to keep the cross out of government. Law enforcement got involved. Security was increased. The FBI was notified. Stephen addressed the congregation that Sunday. "I've received threats," he said plainly. "People who believe that silence is safer than truth. But I serve a Savior who was nailed to a cross, not for staying quiet, but for speaking love when hate demanded silence. So let me be clear, I will not stop." The crowd erupted in standing ovation. Tears flowed freely. Even the security guards, lined at the edges of the sanctuary, were moved. But Stephen wasn't invincible. That night, for the first time in months, fear crept into his mind. Not for himself, but for his family, his kids, his staff, his church. He knelt beside his bed and prayed, "Lord, if I'm stepping out of your will, correct me. If I'm walking too boldly, humble me. But if I'm still carrying what you placed in my hands, strengthen me." The next morning, peace returned. And that same day, a surprise visitor arrived at the church. A man in his mid-60s, dressed modestly, with weathered hands and eyes full of tears. "You don't remember me," he said, "but I used to mock you online. I called you names, said you were dangerous. I was angry, bitter, lost." Stephen waited, listening. "But then, I saw you carry that cross, and something in me broke. I've been watching every sermon since. Last week I gave my life to Jesus." Stephen embraced him without a word, because sometimes the fruit of faith isn't seen in legislation or news cycles, but in one lost soul coming home. As the man walked away, Stephen whispered under his breath, "That's why I carry the cross." And he knew deep down that the battle wasn't over, but neither was the call. In the weeks that followed, Stephen found himself traveling more than he ever had before, not for book tours or conference appearances, but to meet quietly with pastors, community leaders, and ordinary believers who were facing mounting pressure for living out their faith in the open. He sat in the back rooms of rural churches where congregations had been fined for singing too loud. He knelt beside street preachers, cited for disturbing the peace. He encouraged teenage students suspended for starting lunchtime prayer circles. These weren't headline stories. They didn't make the front page or trend on social media, but they were the stories that mattered to him. They were the people who bore the weight of quiet obedience, the kind that didn't look like victory but felt like sacrifice. In Kentucky, he met with a single mom named Carly, who had lost her job at a public library for refusing to remove the cross necklace she'd worn every day for 12 years. The official reason was violating neutrality policies. But Stephen saw the truth behind the words. "They said I could work there," she told him, tears brimming. "Just not openly, just not as who I am." Stephen held her hand and told her, "You're not invisible to God, and you're not alone in this anymore." He made a call that afternoon. The Freedom to Faith Legal Fund took her case pro bono. A week later, the library reversed its decision and issued a public apology. Carly's story, once a whisper of injustice, became a spark of hope for others in similar positions. Stephen returned to Charlotte with a deeper urgency in his spirit. These weren't isolated incidents, they were symptoms of a broader shift, a creeping normalization of shame toward public faith. And he was no longer content to respond case by case. It was time to prepare the church for a new era, not just to endure pressure, but to engage it with strength, wisdom, and grace. He gathered his staff and leaders late one evening and laid out a vision. "We've been reactive long enough," he said. "Now, we prepare." He proposed a new initiative, Cross-Trained, a nationwide program designed to equip believers with both spiritual confidence and civic literacy. The curriculum would cover biblical principles, legal rights, public engagement, and cultural discernment. It would train pastors, students, parents, and professionals to live out their faith boldly and responsibly in a skeptical world. "It's not just about teaching people how to carry the cross," Stephen said. "It's about teaching them how to stand when the world tells them to sit down." The idea caught fire immediately. Partner churches signed up. Donors supported it. Christian universities offered to integrate the program into their theology and public policy departments. Stephen recorded the first video course personally, speaking into the camera with the same intensity and warmth that filled every one of his sermons. He ended the session with a challenge. "Your faith was never meant to be hidden. It was meant to be lived. If you're tired of being quiet, if you're ready to walk boldly in the truth, then get cross-trained. Because the world doesn't need more silent saints. It needs soldiers of grace." Within days, enrollment exceeded all expectations. Hundreds of small groups launched in homes, churches, and online communities. Testimonials poured in. A high school student in Texas shared how he stood up for his right to pray before a track meet. A nurse in Oregon shared how she respectfully declined to participate in a policy she believed violated her conscience and kept her job. A worship leader in Chicago told of how his bandmates, previously skeptical of religion, asked to come to church just to understand why he wouldn't compromise his faith for a record deal. The stories were everywhere, and Stephen knew this was just the beginning. But while progress was being made on the ground, pressure was building from above. News broke that a powerful political organization had drafted a bill designed to limit religious leaders from serving in public advisory roles, citing concerns over undue influence. Though the language was couched in neutrality, it was clear who it targeted and why. Stephen was once again thrust into the spotlight. When asked for comment by a national news anchor, Stephen responded calmly but firmly, "If a public servant can speak from any worldview except a biblical one, then we don't have equality. We have censorship. I'm not asking for a pulpit in every policy meeting. I'm asking for the freedom to bring my full self, including my faith, into the public square." Some called him brave, others called him dangerous, but Stephen didn't waste time reading the headline. He focused on the mission. That Sunday, as he stood before his congregation, he preached a message titled, "Faith on Trial." "It's not just me in the courtroom anymore," he told them. "It's you. It's your children, your classmates, your co-workers. Every believer who chooses to live out their faith with integrity is now standing where I stood, with a choice: be silent or be faithful." He paused and looked across the room. "And I choose faithful." The response was electric. People stood, cried, shouted. Some dropped to their knees. Others raised their hands in surrender. It wasn't hype. It was holy. A collective declaration that faith would not be reduced to a private preference, but honored as a public conviction. After the service, a young couple approached him, holding a small baby wrapped in a blue blanket. "We named him Stephen," the father said. tears streaming. Not just because of you, but because of the Stephen in Acts, the one who stood and never backed down. Stephen held the baby gently and whispered, "He'll carry the cross too one day, and he'll be ready." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the Charlotte skyline, Stephen walked alone through the now famous courtyard cross at Elevation Church. It stood tall, weathered by time and weather, but still firm, a symbol of sacrifice, of courage, of freedom. He laid his hand on the wooden beam and whispered, "Lord, as long as you ask me to carry this, I will. As long as there's breath in my lungs and truth in my soul, I will." And he meant it, because for Stephen Furtick, the cross was never just a symbol, it was a calling. As the weeks turned into months, the momentum didn't slow. Cross-Trained had grown into a full-fledged movement. Partner churches across the nation were hosting weekend intensives. Youth camps were built around the principles of faith and freedom. Even Christian athletes began hosting post-game huddles where they not only shared testimonies, but also educated their peers on the legal rights they had to express their faith publicly. Stephen traveled tirelessly. He'd spend Saturday night preparing a sermon in a hotel room, and Sunday morning preaching to his home congregation via live stream, before catching a flight to a small town for a Monday night town hall. The days were long, and the burdens were heavy, but the fruit was undeniable. And then came an unexpected message. A private letter arrived at his office, sealed with a federal crest. It wasn't a summons, it wasn't a subpoena, it was an invitation. The White House, a private meeting with the president. Stephen's staff was stunned. "They want to hear your perspective," his assistant said quietly. "You've stirred the nation, Pastor. Now, Washington wants to talk." Stephen spent a long time in prayer before giving his answer. This wasn't about access or prestige. This was a delicate, sacred opportunity, and he wasn't interested in photo ops or handshakes. He wanted to speak truth to power, with respect, but without compromise. He arrived in Washington under the radar. No media announcement, no fanfare, just a quiet entrance through a secure gate and a walk through the iconic white corridors of America's most powerful address. Inside the Oval Office, the president greeted him with a cordial handshake. "Pastor Furtick," he said with a smile, "it seems you've started a conversation this country's been avoiding for a long time." Stephen offered a nod. "I didn't start it. I just stopped staying silent about it." The president motioned for him to sit. For the next hour, they talked about the erosion of religious expression, about the tension between public faith and secular policy, about what it meant to live in a country that claimed to value freedom, while often punishing those who used it. Stephen wasn't combative. He wasn't partisan. He spoke with clarity and conviction. "People of faith aren't asking for domination," he said. "They're asking for dignity, for the right to live openly without fear of penalty, for the ability to bring their beliefs into public life without being treated like a threat." The president listened, took notes, asked questions. When the meeting ended, he thanked Stephen for his candor. "You've given me a lot to think about," he said. Stephen left the White House in silence, his heart full and his spirit still. That night, alone in his hotel room, he opened his Bible and landed on 1 Timothy 6:12. "Fight the good fight of the faith. Take hold of the eternal life to which you were called." He underlined it slowly, then closed his eyes and whispered, "Lord, give me the strength to keep fighting." The next morning, Stephen returned to Charlotte to a hero's welcome, but he quickly deflected praise. "This isn't about me," he told the congregation. "It's about the doors God is opening, and it's about what you do when you walk through them." But behind the scenes, the battle was heating up again. The legislation aimed at barring pastors from serving on public advisory boards had made it out of committee. Though its chances of passing were slim, the symbolic weight of it was enormous. It was a signal, a line in the sand. Stephen knew what was at stake, so he decided to act. Not with a rally, not with a protest, with prayer. He announced a 21-day national fast. No gimmicks, no political language, just a call to spiritual arms. Turn off the noise, tune into heaven. Let's remind this nation that God still hears his people, he said. The response was overwhelming. Churches from every denomination joined in. Believers across the nation posted prayers, shared scriptures, and gathered in small groups. Students hosted prayer walks on campus. Truck drivers pulled over at rest stops to kneel in silence. Nurses prayed before their shifts. Soldiers in barracks opened Bibles together. It wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. but it was powerful, and Washington noticed. The bill lost momentum. Lawmakers quietly began distancing themselves. Even prominent media figures started calling it a mistake and poorly timed. The night the bill was officially shelved, Stephen stood before his church and said, "You don't need a microphone to move mountains. You just need mustard seed faith and a God who still parts seas." The crowd stood as one, tears flowing, hands lifted. But Stephen wasn't finished. He announced the next phase, the Carry It Initiative, a nationwide challenge for every believer to carry a physical cross for 1 mile in their hometown, not as a protest, not as a performance, but as a personal statement of surrender, courage, and commitment. Within days, thousands joined in. From California to Maine, believers walked, quietly, faithfully, in parks, through neighborhoods, along beaches and country roads. It became a wave of visual testimony, not political, not performative, just powerful. Even some skeptics were moved. A well-known journalist wrote, "I don't understand their theology, but I respect their resolve." In a world full of shouting, they chose to walk in silence, and somehow it said more than any speech ever could. Stephen walked too. He started at Elevation Church, alone, at dawn, just like before. But this time, as he reached the city square, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. Hundreds of others, carrying crosses, walking in unison, silent, steady, undeterred. Tears filled Stephen's eyes as he joined them. No one spoke. They didn't need to, because that's what revival looks like. Not noise, but obedience. Not power, but presence. Not fear, but faith. When the walk ended, he stood in the middle of the crowd and whispered to himself, "This is what carrying the cross was always meant to be." And in that moment he knew the mission was far from over, but the movement had begun. The momentum from the Carry It initiative didn't fade. If anything, it ignited something deeper across the country. Videos flooded social media. Children with tiny wooden crosses on playgrounds, elderly men and women walking along dirt roads with bowed heads, prison inmates carrying handmade crosses around rec yards, guards watching with respect, some even joining in. Major news outlets had no choice but to cover it. They called it a movement of quiet fire. Analysts were stunned by its simplicity. No slogans, no protests, no speeches, just crosses, carried in silence. Yet the impact was thunderous. Stephen didn't issue statements. He didn't schedule interviews. He just watched and prayed. He had seen many waves of cultural energy rise and fall, but this was different. It wasn't emotionalism, it was surrender. And surrender always lasts longer than hype. At Elevation, the church became a hub of service and equipping. Volunteers packed meals for the homeless. Prayer rooms stayed open 24 hours. Teams were dispatched to small towns to help churches overwhelmed by new believers and seekers looking for truth. And Stephen? He was everywhere and nowhere all at once, sometimes preaching to 20,000, sometimes sitting in a diner across from one broken soul. He didn't chase platforms. He followed purpose, but not everyone celebrated the wave. Opposition, though quieter, grew more calculated. A major tech company removed videos of the Carry It walks from their platform, citing violations of public safety guidelines. Influencers mocked participants, labeling them as brainwashed fundamentalists. Several city councils across the country passed ordinances banning unauthorized religious processions, a vague but clearly targeted measure. Stephen took a deep breath as the reports rolled in. He wasn't surprised. When the church advances, resistance always follows. He addressed his congregation with a calm fire. Don't be afraid when the world pushes back. That means you're moving forward. They don't ban what doesn't bother them. They don't silence what doesn't shake them. If your faith is under fire, it's probably because your flame is burning too bright. People shouted amen. Tears fell, but Stephen didn't bask in it. He was already planning the next move. He called an emergency meeting of the Freedom to Faith Legal Fund. "We can't just defend anymore," he said. "We need to build. The enemy is playing the long game. So must we." What followed was bold. Stephen proposed the creation of the Liberty Watch Network, a coalition of attorneys, pastors, counselors, and civic leaders in every state, trained to respond within 48 hours to any case of religious suppression, no matter how small. Each team would include a legal responder to assess violations, a pastoral responder to offer spiritual support, a media contact to help the community tell its story, a prayer team assigned to every single case. It was audacious. And it worked. Within a month, the network was fully staffed. Churches hosted training seminars. Law students volunteered for internships. Retired judges offered their expertise. Missionary organizations offered transportation and resources. It became the church's response mechanism to a culture growing increasingly hostile to public faith. One morning, Stephen received a call from a small town in Minnesota. A Christian teacher had been suspended for reading a psalm aloud during a moment of silence before school. She hadn't led prayer. She hadn't even referenced God explicitly. She just read Psalm 23 in a whisper. A student recorded it. The district reacted. Stephen didn't even hesitate. Within hours, Liberty Watch was on the ground. The pastor of her local church was notified. The legal team reached out to the school board. Parents in the community rallied in respectful solidarity. 3 days later, the teacher was reinstated, and when asked if she regretted what she did, her answer was simple. I wasn't preaching. I was just reminding myself who my shepherd is. Stephen preached about it the following Sunday. When your faith becomes quiet strength, the world doesn't know how to handle it. Loud opinions are easy to dismiss, but silent obedience? That shakes kingdoms. The crowd responded not with applause, but with stillness. A holy reverence fell over the room. That night, as Stephen sat alone on the rooftop of his home, overlooking the lights of Charlotte, Holly joined him. "You're not sleeping much," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "Are you afraid it'll all disappear?" He shook his head. "No, I'm afraid we'll settle, that we'll get used to the noise and forget the fire." She nodded and leaned her head on his shoulder. "Then keep it burning." A week later, Stephen received word that an international Christian network wanted to replicate Cross-Trained and the Liberty Watch network overseas, in parts of Europe, South America, and even areas in the Middle East where persecution was real, brutal, and daily. Stephen took it to God in prayer. "Lord, this started with a simple walk. One man, one cross. I'm not qualified to lead a global movement, but if you are still with me, I'll go wherever the weight of the cross needs to be carried." The answer came not in thunder or vision, but in peace, a settled knowing, and so he said yes. The vision that began in the streets of Charlotte had become global. Stephen flew to London, São Paulo, and Cairo, meeting underground pastors, worshiping in homes by candlelight, and listening to the stories of those who had been imprisoned, beaten, and ostracized for their faith. He wept with them, prayed with them, learned from them. When he returned to the U.S., he told his congregation, "You think we're bold? You haven't seen bold until you meet a mother who walks 10 miles just to read one page of scripture, or a pastor who preaches through bruised ribs because he refused to close his church." He paused, scanning the room. "We're not just part of a national revival, we're part of a global one, and it's our time to carry it forward." The people stood, not out of hype, but out of holy resolve, because something had shifted in them too, and they were ready to carry the cross, to carry the cost, and to carry the truth wherever it was needed. News of the movement's expansion into other nations brought a renewed focus on the heartbeat of it all, the cross. Not the physical symbol alone, but the lifestyle it demanded: self-denial, boldness, love, obedience, suffering, glory. Stephen was back in Charlotte, standing once again in the sanctuary of Elevation Church, where the wooden cross in the courtyard had become a gathering place for spontaneous worship, late-night prayer, and quiet reflection. People came not for entertainment, but to encounter something eternal. That Sunday, Stephen preached a message called, "The Cross Carries You." He didn't stand on the stage. He walked slowly through the aisles, looking each person in the eyes as he spoke. "You think you're the one carrying it? The truth is, it's been carrying you all along, through your heartbreak, through your failure, through your fear. You don't hold the cross up, it holds you up." A hush fell over the room. People wept silently. Others dropped to their knees. You don't need to be strong to carry the cross. You just need to be willing. You don't have to be loud, just faithful. You don't need a crowd, just conviction. He paused and raised his hand. "And when the world pushes you down, when culture says sit quiet, when fear says don't speak, remember, the cross already made the loudest statement in history, and it's still speaking." That message wasn't just a sermon, it was a commissioning. By Monday, emails and calls poured in. Churches in France began walking with crosses through Paris. A youth group in South Africa hosted a crosswalk event in Johannesburg. A group of believers in Iran, through encrypted messages, shared photos of small crosses drawn in the sand by their feet during covert prayer meetings. It was no longer about a moment. It was a movement. But then, unexpectedly, Stephen received news that stopped him in his tracks. A key leader in the Freedom to Faith Legal Fund had been arrested while assisting a church in a closed country. The charge? Inciting civil unrest through religious activity. Stephen dropped to his knees in his office when he heard, "This isn't a headline," he prayed aloud. "This is a life. This is someone's family. God, show us what to do." Within hours, the church's global partners activated. Lawyers contacted international human rights organizations. Believers around the world joined in fasting and prayer. Stephen flew to Geneva to meet with representatives from the UN Commission on Religious Freedom. His presence wasn't expected, but it was respected. One official asked bluntly, "Why is a pastor leading this charge?" Stephen looked her straight in the eyes and said, "Because if the shepherd doesn't fight for the flock, who will?" The official leaned back, stunned. "You're different. I'm obedient," he replied. 3 weeks later, the charges were dropped. The leader was released and quietly escorted back to safe ground. Stephen met him at a secure location in Istanbul. They hugged for a long time, both men in tears. "I would have stayed longer," the man said, "even behind bars, because it was worth it." Stephen looked at him, his voice breaking. "That's what the cross does. It makes us brave in places we never imagined." When Stephen returned to the U.S., he was changed. Something deeper had settled in his soul, a holy stillness, a reverence for the real cost of what they were doing. He stood before his staff the next day and said, "We're not building a movement, we're building an altar. And every altar requires a sacrifice." They all nodded. Some cried. None turned back. The ministry expanded again, but this time in silence. Underground training centers, digital toolkits for closed nations, secret discipleship communities guided by encrypted platforms. Stephen never publicized it. It wasn't for clicks. It was for souls. And then came the greatest invitation of all. A renowned interfaith summit requested Stephen's presence, not as a debater, but as a voice, a bridge. Leaders from Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, and non-religious backgrounds gathered in one room to discuss freedom of belief and expression in a polarized world. Stephen hesitated before accepting. He wasn't interested in applause or compromise, but the Spirit nudged him, "Go," not to agree, but to shine. At the summit, he sat among scholars and clerics, activists and skeptics. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't prepare a defense. He told a story. "I once walked down a street in North Carolina carrying a cross. They fined me for it. Said I was disturbing the peace, but I wasn't disturbing the peace. I was disturbing the silence. And sometimes that's exactly what the world needs." He spoke of grace, of truth, of the power of conscience and conviction. "I will never force my faith on another, but I will not apologize for living it. And I will stand beside any man or woman, of any faith or no faith, who is denied the right to live from their convictions." Many in the room rose in respect. A few left in quiet protest, but the seed had been sown, and Stephen left knowing he had done what he was called to do. Back in Charlotte, Elevation Church had become more than a building. It was a base camp, a launch pad, a beacon. People no longer came for the music or the lights. They came for the cross. The same one Stephen carried that day on the street, the same one that carried him through courtrooms, hate mail, death threats, and international summits. The same one that carried a movement now breathing life into dry bones around the world. One night, walking the halls of the church, Stephen saw a janitor kneeling by the base of the wooden cross in the courtyard. He didn't disturb him, he just watched. And in that moment, he realized, the cross doesn't need a campaign, it needs carriers. And carriers don't seek glory, they seek obedience. Stephen whispered into the night, "Let me carry it, Lord, every day, until the day you call me home." And the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was holy. A few weeks later, as spring settled in over Charlotte, Stephen found himself walking the quiet corridors of Elevation Church late one evening. The sanctuary lights were dimmed, but the cross in the courtyard still stood illuminated under the stars. It had become a symbol far beyond what any of them had imagined, a place of pilgrimage for many, a reminder for all. He paused at the entrance to the sanctuary, watching a group of teenagers kneeling in prayer near the altar. No one had told them to be there. No event was scheduled. They had come on their own, seeking God in the silence, yearning for something real, and they had found it. Stephen sat on the back row and listened, not to music or preaching, but to the sound of quiet surrender. The Spirit was moving. Again, his phone buzzed gently in his pocket. A message from a friend in government. New executive order passed. Faith expression in public spaces reprotected. Language mirrors your case almost word for word. Quiet victory, but a big one. Stephen closed his eyes and breathed deeply. Not a speech, not a rally, not a fight, just the consistent weight of the cross. Carried long enough, it had spoken for itself. That week, he was invited to return to the state capitol for a private prayer gathering with leaders across different political affiliations. No press, no cameras, just a room full of lawmakers, some believers, some not, all asking to hear from the man who had turned courtroom defeats into cultural revival. He walked in humbly, carrying nothing but his worn Bible. They asked him to speak, to guide the prayer. Stephen stood, open to Micah 6:8, and read, "What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Then he prayed. He didn't pray for parties to win or for power to shift. He prayed for hearts to soften, for truth to be revealed, for courage to rise. And when he opened his eyes, some in the room were crying. One senator approached him afterward. "I've mocked your church for years," he admitted. "I thought you were manipulating people. But now, I think I see the difference between manipulation and conviction, and I want what you have." Stephen didn't preach. He just nodded. "It's not mine, but it's freely given." Back at Elevation, the cross-trained program had reached its 100,000th participant. Small towns across America were reporting school clubs starting up again. Chaplains were requesting more resources than ever. And for the first time, a survey showed a sharp rise in young adults who felt free to express faith in public. But Stephen didn't see numbers. He saw faces, stories, testimonies, and it kept him moving. Then came a new opportunity, an invitation to write a book, but not a typical book. A legal publisher asked him to co-author a work on faith and the Constitution, a resource for law schools and ministries alike. They didn't want a religious treatise. They wanted his journey, his perspective, his legal mind, his spiritual heart. Stephen hesitated. "I never set out to be a legal voice," he told his team. "But you are," Holly said, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. "Because you didn't run from the pressure. You walked through it with the cross on your back." He prayed over it, and then he said yes. The book titled Carried: How the Cross Walked Me Through the Fire, launched quietly but exploded in reach. Churches used it. Law professors taught it. Judges referenced it. Stephen remained grounded. He kept preaching every Sunday, kept visiting hospitals in the middle of the night, kept sending handwritten letters to discouraged pastors around the world. And one day, a pastor from Uganda visited Charlotte. He was small in stature, but mighty in faith. Through a translator, he told Stephen, "Your cross gave me courage to carry mine. In our village, they burned our church, but we rebuilt it, and we walk with the cross every Sunday now. They try to silence us, but we have already died to fear." Stephen embraced him. No words were needed. Their eyes spoke the language of sacrifice. In the months that followed, the Liberty Watch network began receiving calls from outside the Christian faith, Muslims, Jews, even agnostics who had been silenced in public forums. They had seen how Stephen's movement wasn't just about defending one group, but defending freedom for all. Stephen welcomed them. "If we fight only for ourselves, we miss the point," he told his team. Religious liberty means liberty for the person across the table, not just the one in our pew. And so, the network expanded again, respectfully, carefully, unapologetically grounded in Christian truth, but open to defending the principle for everyone who needed it. Stephen knew some would criticize him for it, but he also knew Jesus didn't only eat with saints. One night, as he prepared for a small pastor's retreat, Stephen sat down to write a message titled Still Carrying. It was meant to be quiet, reflective, a conversation more than a sermon. He started with these words: "I thought I'd set the cross down by now. Thought I'd pass it to someone younger, stronger, faster, but the longer I carry it, the lighter it feels. Not because the burden has changed, but because the one who walks with me has carried most of the weight." He stopped, looked at the words, whispered thanks, and then he walked outside, barefoot, into the cool night air. The moon lit the courtyard. The wooden cross stood where it always had, unchanged, weathered by storms, undisturbed by headlines. He walked up to it, placed both hands on the beam and said, "You were never mine to carry alone. Thank you for carrying me." And from the stillness he heard it, not with his ears, but with his soul. Well done. In the months that followed, Stephen continued to walk in a strange and sacred balance between global influence and local faithfulness. He still preached every Sunday, still made time for quiet counseling sessions with congregants, still showed up for weddings and funerals with the same humility he'd had before the world ever knew his name. But now, everything he did echoed further. One evening, after preaching a midweek message on perseverance, Stephen sat alone in the sanctuary, staring up at the cross above the platform. A young man quietly approached, hesitant at first. He looked nervous, like someone unsure if he belonged in such a space. Stephen turned and smiled. "Come on in." The young man sat beside him, hands shaking. "You don't know me?" he said, "but I saw you speak at that summit last year. I'm not a Christian, never have been, but I've never seen someone talk about truth like you did, without anger, without trying to win a fight." Stephen nodded. "Truth doesn't need to be loud to be strong." The man swallowed hard. "I've been scared to speak my own truth, afraid I'd be hated, mocked, shut down." "You're not alone in that," Stephen said. "That's why the cross matters, because it proves that silence isn't holiness, and that obedience costs something." The young man looked at him, eyes wet with something between curiosity and hope. "I don't know if I'm ready for faith," he said, "but I want to be brave like you." Stephen placed a hand on his shoulder. "Bravery isn't loud, it's obedient. Start with that." They sat in silence for a long time. No altar call, no pressure, just presence. Later that week, the young man returned, this time with a Bible someone had given him, and the week after that, he brought 2 friends. Quiet revival continued, one soul at a time, but the weight of the movement was real. The invitations kept coming, to speak at universities, to consult on new religious freedom bills, to advise international organizations. Stephen accepted some, declined many. He had learned how to guard his heart from the seduction of influence. He was a pastor before he was a voice, and yet, the tension never disappeared. One night, during a leadership team retreat in the mountains, Stephen stood in front of his closest friends and confessed something he hadn't said aloud. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm still called to carry it," he said softly. "The cross hasn't changed, but the world has, and so have I." They all looked at him with deep affection. One of his elders stood and said, "The weight may feel different, but the assignment hasn't changed, and we haven't followed you because you're perfect. We followed you because you're faithful." That night, Stephen lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet except for the soft wind outside. He prayed, "God, I never wanted this. I never wanted fame, just to be faithful. But if there's someone else you'd rather give this to, I'll let go." There was no thunderous reply, just peace. And that was enough. The next morning, as the sun broke over the ridge, he walked outside alone, carrying a small wooden cross he had brought with him in a bag. It was rough, hand-carved by a pastor in India. He held it tightly and whispered, "I still will. As long as you ask me to, I still will." Back in Charlotte, a new development unfolded. A public high school football coach had been fired for leading his team in prayer before games. No pressure, no requirement, just a quiet prayer circle for whoever wanted to join. Stephen flew out to the coach's town with a Liberty Watch team. He met the man, shook his hand, and listened to his story. The coach didn't want media attention. He didn't want money. He just wanted his job back and the freedom to pray without fear. Stephen stood beside him at a town meeting, speaking not as a famous pastor, but as a man of the people. "We're not asking for dominance," Stephen said, his voice steady. "We're asking for dignity. If a man can lead his team in a chant, why can't he lead them in a prayer?" The room erupted in applause. A week later, the coach was reinstated. When Stephen got back home, he was greeted by a small gathering of local pastors who had come just to say thank you. "Most of us don't have your reach," one of them said, "but we carry the cross with you, one corner at a time." Stephen was moved beyond words. Later that night, he stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching his youngest son, Graham, playing near the base of the cross. The boy looked up and said, "Daddy, when I'm big, I want to carry it too." Stephen smiled. "You already are, buddy, just by loving Jesus." He bent down, scooped him into his arms, and held him close. That moment burned into his heart, a reminder that legacy wasn't measured in buildings or platforms, but in what was passed from one generation to the next. The next morning, Stephen received a letter, handwritten with no return address. Inside was a small piece of wood and a simple note. "I saw you carry it. Now I carry mine. Thank you." Stephen held the fragment in his hand, tears slipping down his face. Because that's what the cross does. It multiplies in silence. It empowers in weakness. It lives on, long after the cameras turn off. And Stephen knew, more than ever, that he wasn't just building a church. He was helping build a generation of carriers. Months passed, but the flame never dimmed. The movement had shifted from national headlines to something even more powerful, an integrated part of daily life for millions of believers across the country. It no longer depended on Stephen to keep it alive. It had taken root in homes, in schools, in quiet hearts. The cross had been passed, not abandoned, but multiplied. Yet, even with the momentum, Stephen never let himself grow comfortable. He knew the nature of spiritual battle. He knew complacency was more dangerous than persecution, so he kept his heart postured low. He kept listening, kept walking, and then came the message that humbled him to the core. A letter arrived from a young girl in a detention center in Arizona. Her name was Camilla, 13 years old, incarcerated after a long line of foster placements and a desperate string of poor decisions. Her handwriting was shaky, her grammar rough, but her words unforgettable. "Dear Pastor Stephen, I saw your cross video on a TV in juvie. It made me cry. Not because I felt guilty, I already do, but because for the first time, I believe someone like me could be forgiven. I prayed out loud for the first time after that. They laughed at me. I didn't care. I want to carry my cross too. I carved one into the wall by my bed. Please don't stop preaching. People like me are listening." Stephen sat in his office, the letter trembling in his hands. He whispered through tears, "Lord, let me never forget why you called me. Let me never preach for the stage when the walls of a cell hold your next worshiper." He wrote Camilla back personally, a long, handwritten letter filled with scripture, encouragement, and truth. He sent her a Bible with her name engraved in gold leaf, and in it he wrote, "You are not what you've done. You are who He calls you, and He calls you His." Camilla's story shook something loose in Stephen's spirit. He called a meeting with the Liberty Watch leadership team and proposed a new branch of ministry, Crossreach, a spiritual initiative aimed at reaching incarcerated youth and adults, equipping chaplains in detention centers with faith-based materials, and raising up cross carriers in the darkest places of society. Within weeks, prisons began requesting Crossreach resources. Letters came in by the hundreds. Inmates shared how the image of Stephen carrying a cross down the street had reminded them of a Savior who carried theirs up a hill. Some had nothing left in this world, but now they had Jesus, and it was enough. One day, Stephen visited a federal prison outside Atlanta. He stood in a gymnasium surrounded by more than 200 inmates, some hardened, some humbled. He didn't preach a polished sermon. He told them the truth. "I don't stand here because I'm better. I stand here because I know what it means to be carried by grace. The cross wasn't just for the free, it was for the captive too." He paused and looked into their eyes, one by one. "And you may be behind bars, but you are not beyond redemption." A few cried. Most just nodded in silence. But in that silence, heaven moved. After that visit, one of the inmates, a former gang leader, started a prayer circle in his unit. Another began memorizing scripture. One man wrote a worship song titled "Chains Can't Stop Praise," and with permission, recorded it on a prison phone. It went viral online. Stephen shared the story with his church. "This is what real revival looks like," he said, voice trembling. "Not just in packed churches with lights and music, but in cells, in silence, with nothing but a broken heart and an open heaven." The congregation stood in reverent awe. They weren't watching a pastor anymore. They were watching a man walking in obedience. At home, Holly could see the change too. "You don't talk about stages like you used to," she said one night as they sat together on the porch. watching fireflies blink in the yard. "I guess the older I get," Stephen replied, "the more I realize that the real platforms are the ones no one sees." She reached over and took his hand. "I think the cross has made you stronger." He smiled. "No, it just made me smaller. And that's what makes you strong." Meanwhile, Cross-Trained had reached more than 250,000 participants across 4 continents. Liberty Watch had expanded into 14 countries. CrossReach was officially recognized as a top rehabilitation partner by the National Chaplains Association. And yet, Stephen never let the spotlight shine on the brand. He kept it on the cross. Always. Because he remembered the beginning, the fine, the courtroom, the humiliation, the legal arguments, the disbelief that carrying a cross could ever be called a crime. And he remembered the judge, the one in that first courtroom who ruled against him. But now, that same judge, Judge Ronald Ellison, sat in the front row of Elevation Church every Sunday, a quiet miracle no one could have predicted. He had come back, broken, searching. And one day, after a sermon titled "The Verdict That Saved Us," he met Stephen in the lobby. "I find you for faith," he said, "and then I found mine through you." Stephen embraced him, no words needed. Because that's what the cross does. It humbles judges, it frees prisoners, it steadies pastors, it heals daughters like Camilla, and it keeps on carrying those who choose to carry it. That night, Stephen knelt once again in the courtyard, at the base of that same old cross. His voice was tired, but his spirit was full. "Still carrying, Lord," he whispered, and still carried. A few weeks later, Stephen received an invitation unlike any other. A prestigious university, once openly critical of public faith expression, wanted to host a campus-wide dialogue titled "The Cross in Culture: Past, Present, and Future." They wanted Stephen to lead the keynote conversation. It wasn't a debate, it was an open table, and they made it clear. The invitation wasn't out of agreement, but respect. Stephen prayed for 3 days before answering. He'd always told his team, "We don't show up to prove anything, we show up to serve." So when he finally said yes, he went not with talking points, but with testimony. The auditorium was packed the night he arrived. Students of all beliefs, professors, skeptics, even reporters. There was a tension in the room, not hostile, but charged with anticipation. They all knew what he stood for. They'd all seen the video of him walking with the cross, standing in courtrooms, speaking before senators. But now they'd see something else. The quiet, grounded presence of a man who hadn't let the platform pollute the message. He opened with a story they didn't expect. "When I was 14, he said, "I almost walked away from my faith. I didn't feel like I belonged. I didn't think I was good enough, and the weight of trying to get it right almost crushed me." The room shifted. Students leaned in. "But then I found out the cross isn't about how strong you are. It's about how surrendered you are." He looked across the faces. "And I know some of you in this room feel like you don't belong. Maybe not to a church, maybe not to any religion, maybe not even to your own family. But I want to tell you something." He paused. "You are not invisible to God." A few gasps, a few tears. Even the moderator, a known secularist, nodded quietly. Stephen didn't preach at them. He walked with them through philosophy, history, justice, and scripture. He didn't dodge hard questions. He didn't soften truth, but he wrapped every word in grace. When he finished, the crowd rose, not in a standing ovation, but in collective reverence. Something in that room had changed. The university offered to start an interfaith ethics forum in Stephen's honor, inviting voices of all backgrounds to continue the work of respectful conviction. He thanked them and gently declined the naming honor. "Don't name it after me," he said. "Name it after the truth." Back in Charlotte, he returned to his rhythm. Early mornings in prayer, handwritten notes to discouraged pastors, surprise hospital visits to congregants battling cancer. He didn't let the accolades distract him from the quiet corners of ministry that had always meant the most. But one moment that week shook him to his core. During a small group Q&A at church, a 7-year-old girl raised her hand and asked, "Pastor Stephen, is it hard to carry the cross when your heart is tired?" The room fell silent. Stephen's eyes filled instantly. He knelt beside her and said, "Yes, sweetheart, it is. But that's when Jesus carries me the most." He looked up at the group, eyes glassy. "Some of you are tired, Not just in your body, but in your hope. And I get it. I've smiled through exhaustion, preached through heartache, carried the cross when I wanted to lay it down, but let me tell you something. He stood. He never asked you to carry it perfectly. He just asked you to carry it faithfully. That moment became a turning point. A new sermon series was born, The Carriers. It wasn't about influence, it was about endurance. About teachers who prayed before entering their classrooms, about single parents who chose grace instead of revenge, about cashiers who slipped scripture cards into grocery bags, about missionaries who kept going after years without fruit. It wasn't flashy, but it was holy, and people responded. Testimonies poured in by the thousands. One woman had been silently witnessing to her abusive ex-husband for years. After watching the Carriers series, he attended church with her for the first time. Another man, once a vocal atheist, began attending small groups simply to listen. But the most shocking message came in a private email from someone Stephen never thought he'd hear from again. Judge Ronald Ellison. Again. Only this time he wasn't just attending church. He wanted to be baptized. Stephen wept when he read the message. "I sentenced you for carrying a cross," the judge wrote, "but your obedience has led me to carry mine. I finally laid down my pride, and I picked up grace." The baptism took place on a quiet Sunday afternoon, after the main services were done. Stephen and the judge stepped into the water together. No cameras, no crowd, just a few staff, family members, and the weight of something eternal. As Stephen lowered him into the water, he whispered, "The judge has been judged and redeemed." When Ellison rose from the water, he looked like a man reborn, free. Afterward, Stephen sat on the edge of the baptistry alone, soaking wet, heart full. He prayed, "Lord, you keep using the foolish things to confound the wise. Keep using me." That night back at home, Stephen lit a candle and sat at his writing desk. He opened a fresh journal page and wrote at the top, Part 4 of the journey, The Carriers. Underneath, he wrote, "Some carry microphones, others carry mops, some carry children, others carry grief, but when you carry it for Him, it carries you too." Then he closed the journal and walked once more into the night, barefoot, quiet, toward the cross in the courtyard, still standing, still steady, still calling. The next morning, Stephen awoke before sunrise. He slipped out of bed gently so as not to wake Holly, brewed a small cup of coffee, and stepped onto the back porch, wrapping himself in a hoodie. The air was crisp and the world was still. The only sound was the distant hum of early traffic and the steady rhythm of his own breath. He looked out into the dim light of dawn and thought about the journey. It started with a fine. It became a fire. And now it was a field, sprawling, ripe, and full of harvest. But Stephen had learned something the hard way. When momentum builds, so does spiritual warfare. Just the day before, he'd received an anonymous letter laced with venom. "You're poisoning the next generation with delusion. The cross is dead. So are your ideas." Years ago, those words might have rattled him, but now he barely blinked. He didn't carry the cross because it was easy. He carried it because it was eternal. That day, as he walked through the church lobby before a leadership development class, he noticed something new. A row of hand-painted crosses lining the back wall. Dozens of them, each unique, each created by someone in the congregation during the Carriers series. Some were vibrant with colors and scripture verses. Others were plain, raw wood, nails visible, no polish, just like the one he'd carried years before. He paused before a small one made by a young boy in the children's ministry. It simply read, "For my daddy, he will come back to Jesus." Stephen touched the surface of the little cross and whispered, "Amen." That night, during an online Q&A session, someone asked him a question that pierced deep. "Pastor, do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you hadn't picked up that cross?" He thought for a moment. "I would have been safer," he said softly. "Less criticized, less tired, probably more popular." He paused, looked into the camera. "But I wouldn't have been free." He leaned forward. "When you pick up the cross, you lose some things. Approval, ease, reputation. But you gain something this world can never give you. The power to stand in truth, with nothing to prove." Thousands watching from around the world were still, some sobbing, some nodding, all convicted. A church from South Korea messaged immediately after the live stream. "We watched, all of us, elders and youth. We prayed after. And we are starting a crosswalk in Seoul next week. We will carry it in silence and love. Thank you for not quitting." Stephen felt his throat tighten. He replied simply, "He carried it for us. We carry it for him." A few days later, he traveled to New York for a private gathering of leaders from business, entertainment, media, and faith. He hadn't planned to attend. It wasn't his world. But the invitation had come from a Christian entrepreneur who told Stephen, "Your story has opened doors here. People are listening, but they need more than inspiration. They need truth." The room was filled with suits and strategy, people who shaped culture. Stephen felt the weight of the space. When he was handed the mic, he didn't perform. He told them about Camilla in the detention center, about the judge who found grace, about the janitor who now led Bible studies in a corporate tower. Then he held up a small cross, carved from olive wood, gifted to him by a widow in Jerusalem, and said, "This little piece of wood has done what no legislation or platform or brand ever could. It's pierced hearts, it's broken chains, it's restored dignity, and it's still doing it." He looked around the room. "You want to change the world? Carry this. Quietly, consistently, in boardrooms, on sound stages, behind spreadsheets, because the cross doesn't need a spotlight, it just needs a vessel." There were no applause, just silence, holy silence. Afterwards, several came up, not to compliment but to confess. One woman, a media executive, said through tears, "I haven't prayed in years, but tonight I felt something I can't explain." Stephen didn't try to explain it. He just pointed upward. That night, as he sat alone in his hotel room overlooking the lights of Manhattan, he prayed, "Lord, I don't want to go where you haven't sent me. Keep me invisible if that protects the message. But if you want me here, in this place of influence, give me courage to carry the cross in every room, even the ones where no one wants to see it." A few days later, he returned to Charlotte and found a note waiting on his desk. It was from Camilla. She was being released early due to good behavior and a strong report from her counselor. She'd written, "Pastor Stephen, I'm free now, and not just from the center, from everything. I've started writing Bible verses on the shoes I wear. Every step I take, I want to remember who carried me through. Thank you." He sat in his office and cried, deep, shaking sobs. Because for all the platforms and meetings and laws changed, this was it. This was the gospel. One heart, set free, walking forward, remembering. That Sunday, Stephen preached a simple message titled, "What She Wrote on Her Shoes." He told Camilla's story with her permission, and he challenged everyone in the room. You don't need a mic. You don't need a title. You need faith and a willingness to carry the cross on your back, in your hands, or written on your shoes. People didn't clap. They wept. That night, the church parking lot was filled with people walking in silence, some barefoot, some not, tracing a path around the property, whispering prayers, writing scripture on note cards, on notebooks, even on the soles of their shoes. And as Stephen watched from a distance, his hand resting once again on the wooden beam in the courtyard, he whispered, "It's still working, Lord, still reaching, still restoring. Let me never forget. This is why I carry it." And somewhere, far beyond what he could see, another cross was being lifted by another soul, because when one man carries it faithfully, others learn how. That week, Stephen took a short break, his first in over a year. Holly had insisted, gently but firmly. "You can't pour from an empty cup," she had said, placing his suitcase on the bed and packing it herself. They spent 3 days in the mountains, just the two of them. No phones, no email, no interviews. Just long walks, slow meals, quiet prayers. On the second night, sitting by the fire outside their cabin, Stephen stared up at the stars. "Do you ever wonder," he said softly, "how different our life would have been if I hadn't picked up that cross?" Holly leaned into his shoulder. "I wonder how many lives wouldn't have been touched if you hadn't." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I still feel the weight of it, even when I'm resting." She nodded. "That's because it's part of you now." He smiled. "Or maybe I'm part of it." When they returned home, Stephen felt renewed. Not just physically, but spiritually. Realigned, refocused, and just in time because new challenges were emerging. A major national broadcast network had canceled a scheduled interview with Stephen, citing internal policy shifts regarding guests with religious affiliations. Behind closed doors, the reason was clear. His influence had become too bold, too present, too real. Stephen didn't react in anger. He didn't post about it. He just prayed. He preached that Sunday on Matthew 5:14. "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden." He looked out over the congregation. They're trying to hide the hill, but they can't extinguish the light. People rose to their feet, not in defiance but in faith. Stephen wasn't calling them to rage. He was calling them to shine. The next morning, a major podcast with millions of listeners reached out to invite Stephen as a guest. The host wasn't a believer. He'd been skeptical of religion his whole life, but he'd seen the Carry It movement, and something about it wouldn't leave him alone. Stephen accepted the invitation. The conversation aired live, and it was raw. The host began, "I don't get you, man. You've got thousands of people following you, but you don't act like a celebrity. You're not selling some 5-step plan. You're just carrying a cross." Stephen chuckled. "That's the point. The cross doesn't need polish. It just needs presence." The host leaned in. "But isn't that old-fashioned? The world's moved on from all that." Stephen's voice lowered. "The world may have moved on, but the pain hasn't. People are still searching, still broken, still ashamed, and the cross is the only thing that offers both justice and mercy in the same breath." The host was quiet, visibly shaken, and when the episode ended, the inboxes flooded. Not from angry critics, from quiet listeners. One message read, "I haven't prayed in 10 years, but after hearing that, I did, for the first time." Another, "I bought a small cross and put it in my glove box. I don't know why, but I feel like I'm supposed to carry it." Stephen smiled. He didn't need to see the fruit. He just needed to plant the seed. At Elevation, things kept growing, but not in the way the world measured. Sure, attendance was strong, but what truly marked the season was the depth. Prayer meetings that lasted hours with no agenda. Teenagers leading worship with tears streaming down their faces. Men gathering before sunrise to pray over their families. And one Sunday, something extraordinary happened. A man walked into the sanctuary during worship, barefoot, holding a blood-stained shirt and a crumpled letter. His name was Marcus, a former gang member from Chicago, released from prison 3 days earlier. He didn't know what Elevation Church was. He had just Googled, "Where do I carry the cross?" Stephen met him at the altar personally. Marcus handed him the shirt. "This was the night I should have died. I was shot 5 times, but I lived. And while I was recovering in prison, someone passed me your story. I thought it was fake, but I kept reading, and I started writing letters to people I'd hurt. This is the last one." Stephen held the letter with both hands. "Reverent, you know what this is, Marcus?" he asked. "No," Marcus whispered. "It's resurrection." The next week, Marcus was baptized by Stephen himself. His letter placed inside a waterproof pouch and buried beneath the cross in the courtyard as a symbol of forgiveness and freedom. Stephen didn't post about it, didn't tell the press. He just whispered, "This is why I carry it." That night, as he lay in bed beside Holly, she rolled over and asked, "Are you okay?" Stephen stared at the ceiling. "I'm not tired," he said. "I should be, but I'm not. I feel like something's coming, something bigger." She placed a hand on his chest. "You'll carry it." And he knew. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be easy, but the cross had never promised easy. Only eternal, only worth it, only Jesus. 2 weeks later, as summer settled over Charlotte, a storm was brewing, not in the sky but in the spiritual atmosphere. A major national organization filed a petition to label the Carry It initiative as religious activism masquerading as public disruption. They called for restrictions in several states on unsanctioned cross processions and urged local governments to require permits and impose limitations. The goal was clear: slow the movement down. Stephen sat in his office, the printed petition in hand. He'd seen opposition before: mockery, threats, even lawsuits. But this felt different. It wasn't just resistance, it was strategy. He closed the folder and bowed his head. "God, they're not fighting me. They're fighting you. I'll go wherever you lead, but help me do it with the right spirit." He stood, walked slowly into the sanctuary, and fell to his knees at the base of the platform. He didn't say much, just stayed there, still, listening, waiting. Within a few hours, the news had spread. His team gathered quietly. No panic, just prayer. Holly arrived, calm and confident. She sat beside Stephen in the green room, took his hand and said, "It's just another mile, babe. That's all. Another mile with the cross. Stephen nodded. Then let's walk it. The next morning he released a short video. No music, no edits, just his face. I'm not here to create trouble, he said. I'm here to carry truth. The cross doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It walks. Steady, bold, gentle, and will keep walking. It went viral in under an hour. Support came pouring in. Pastors, rabbis, imams, Sikhs, atheists, civil rights leaders. Some agreed with his theology, others didn't. But they agreed on one thing. People should never be penalized for walking in their beliefs with peace and conviction. One letter came from a Holocaust survivor named Miriam. She wrote, "I've seen what happens when people are told to hide their faith. You remind me that courage still lives. Keep carrying it. We're walking behind you." Stephen cried when he read it. He knew what was at stake, and not just for Christians, for everyone. That Sunday, Elevation Church held its largest outdoor service to date. Thousands gathered on the church grounds. No stage, no lights, just worship under the open sky. Stephen stood in the center of the crowd with a simple wooden cross in his arms. He didn't preach. He read from John 19. Then he lowered the cross to the grass and invited anyone who wanted to kneel to join him. They did. Hundreds. Then thousands. In silence. In surrender. From that moment forward, the movement transformed again. It wasn't just about walking. It became about kneeling. The kneel. It campaign launched not as a trend, but as a call. To humility, to prayer, to repentance. People knelt in parks, in gyms, at job sites, in kitchens, wherever they felt led, and lives kept changing. A young woman knelt alone on a college campus during finals week. 2 days later, 3 of her classmates joined her. By the end of the semester, 47 students were attending weekly prayer gatherings in the library basement. A fire chief knelt in full gear at the station before his shift. Now the whole team joins him. Even a U.S. senator, known for his sharp tongue and political pride, knelt behind closed doors in his office and later confessed it publicly. "This man reminded me," he said in a speech, "that bowing before God makes you stand taller before men." Meanwhile, Stephen remained steady. He didn't chase headlines. He didn't build strategy decks. He just kept doing what he had done from the beginning, carrying it. One morning, while walking through the church cafe, he spotted an older man sitting by the window, sipping coffee alone and crying. Stephen approached him gently. "Can I sit with you?" The man nodded, wiping his eyes. "I lost my son 5 years ago," he said. "I walked away from faith, from everything. But then I saw you carry the cross on the news, and I didn't know why. But I started going for walks again, every morning, with a little wooden cross in my pocket." Stephen said nothing. The man looked up at him. "I haven't been back to church in a long time, but I figured maybe the God who still carries you can still carry me." Stephen placed a hand on his shoulder. "He already is." Later that day, Stephen journaled one sentence. "The cross doesn't fix everything instantly, but it carries you while God does." That phrase became a banner. A message for the weary, printed on cards, whispered in hospital rooms, spoken over gravesides, tucked into lunch boxes. And as fall approached, the movement reached a threshold no one could have predicted: a worldwide Carry It Sunday. Churches in over 80 countries coordinated to walk with crosses in their communities on the same day, some publicly, some in secret, some with crowds, some alone. Camilla, now 17, led her first youth service that weekend. Marcus led his first prison chapel. The judge who once fined Stephen now served as legal counsel for Liberty Watch. And Stephen? He carried a new cross that morning. Not heavy, not grand, just a small one, carved from pieces of wood sent from believers across the world. He carried it through Charlotte, the same route as the first walk. But this time, he wasn't alone. The streets filled behind him. Thousands. Old and young, black and white, rich and poor, some carrying crosses, some carrying pain, all carrying hope. And Stephen turned, tears pouring, whispering, "This is not my victory. This is yours, Lord, all yours." The cross had spoken, not just to a courtroom, not just to a country, but to a generation, and it was still speaking, still carrying, still calling. That night, after the global Carry It Sunday had swept across nations and hearts like a holy tide, Stephen returned home. He walked slowly through the quiet house. The walls felt heavier, as though they too had carried the weight of 1,000 unseen prayers. Holly was already asleep, a Bible open on her chest, a small light casting a soft glow over her peaceful face. Stephen smiled and stood for a moment at the doorframe. How many times had she prayed when no one saw, carried him when he couldn't carry himself? He whispered a thank you, not to her, but to God, for giving him the kind of partner who didn't need a platform to be powerful. He walked out to the back porch, barefoot as always. The air was thick with late summer humidity, but there was a breeze, like breath from heaven. He sat down and opened his journal one last time. Part 20, The Final Mile. And he began to write. It was never about the courtroom, never about the cameras, never about the walk. It was about obedience, about one yes that turned into another, about one step in surrender that opened a road the world couldn't close. I've carried it through city streets, across borders, into prisons, behind pulpits, through storms, through silence. I've carried it tired, carried it weeping, carried it not knowing where the road would lead. But tonight I sit here, not as a man who finished anything. I sit here as a man still being carried. He closed the journal, and then his phone buzzed. One last message. It was a video from a small village in Nepal. A boy no older than 10 was walking along a mountain path at sunrise, alone, carrying a cross made of bamboo and rope. No music, no narration, just his bare feet, and his shadow stretching long in the morning light. Under the video, the sender had written, "He saw your story through a missionary, said he wanted to walk like the man in America. He doesn't speak English, doesn't know your name, but he knows the cross." Stephen watched it again and again. Tears blurred the screen. Not from pride, but from awe. God had taken his weakness and turned it into a road others could walk on. Not because he was strong, but because he kept saying yes. He stood, walked down into the backyard and knelt in the grass. He looked up at the sky, cloudless, quiet, eternal. He raised his hands and whispered, "Lord, if this was the final mile, thank you for every step. If there's another, I'll take it. If you ask me to carry it again tomorrow, I will. Not for glory, not for history, but for you." He stayed there for a long time, the dew soaking into his jeans, the weight lifting from his shoulders, his soul wrapped in the warmth of divine peace. And in the silence, Stephen Furtick, pastor, preacher, son, servant, heard the only voice that ever mattered. Well done. The cross still stood, the church still walked, and somewhere in the world, another carrier rose. And if you've made it this far, if you've walked every mile of this story with us, then maybe this wasn't just a video. Maybe it was something more. Maybe it was a whisper from God. Maybe it was a reminder that you too are called to carry the cross, not a wooden beam across your back, but the quiet courage to stand for truth in a world that often doesn't want to hear it. The choice to live with integrity when compromise is easier. The decision to love boldly, serve faithfully, and follow Jesus, no matter the cost. This story wasn't about a courtroom. It wasn't about a man named Stephen Furtick. It was about obedience. It was about surrender. It was about what happens when one person says yes to God and never looks back. Because when you carry the cross, you don't just carry a symbol. You carry the message of hope, of mercy, of redemption. And maybe you've been tired. Maybe you've been mocked. Maybe you've wanted to give up. But let this be your sign. Don't stop walking. The world doesn't need louder voices. It needs deeper conviction. It needs people who don't just speak about faith, but walk it out, one step at a time, one silent act of love at a time, one yes at a time. So if this video touched your heart, don't let it end here. Carry it forward. Share it with someone who's close to giving up. Speak life. Walk with compassion. Live with purpose. Because revival isn't always loud. Sometimes it begins with a whisper, a walk, a cross. And if you're still watching, if your heart is burning, then maybe, just maybe, God is calling you to carry it too. Don't ignore that voice. Don't silence that pull. Say yes. Pick it up and walk.